Welcome to AI Horror Stories. Prepare to be chilled. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell for daily doses of AI-generated fright. The story revolves around Jenna, a young woman living alone in a remote cabin. She encounters a wounded wolf during a blizzard and decides to nurse it back to health. This experience transforms her, bringing about a sense of purpose and a newfound connection to nature. Let's begin story. The steady rhythm of her pews was too much for him to resist. She was his, and he needed to mark her as so. Jenna chewed her lip as her eyes ravaged the remainder of the page. She'd read the story a dozen times before, but the scene was her favorite. Her stomach flipped as she absently grabbed a chocolate from the open box beside her. Bang! A gust of howling wind blew open the kitchen shutters. She clutched her chest, closed the book, and took a deep breath. Damn latch! Her maintenance skills didn't seem to be enough to combat the impending storm. The fire crackled in the hearth, taunting her with the fact that she'd have to venture away from its warmth and brave the plummeting temperature outside. She set the book on the side table and stood, collecting her father's old denim jacket from the hook. She had her own, but she still chose his as if it would somehow bring him with her. If her father were still alive, the latch would be like new. As it was, she wondered how long the old cabin would remain standing. It was almost like the place knew when he'd ceased to exist, and it had chosen to rot along with him. When she opened the back door, the snow and wind gave a howling greeting and fought to get inside. She pulled the denim tighter, forced the door shut with her back, then turned to the still banging shutters. The latch shimmered in the deepening snow below, completely broken off with the rusted screw still attached. The steps were slick with ice, the ground at the bottom slush. She gripped the rail, moving slow, then teetered as her boots disappeared beneath the fluff. The snowfall clouded her sight, and she bent down to retrieve her target before it could disappear. The hole in the shutter was so worn, she didn't even need to twist the screw. It slid into place with a wiggling testament to how long it would hold, but Jarina latched the hook as if the problem were solved. A deep, mournful howie pulled her attention toward the trees. She tightened her head, listening harder, but the wind whistled in reply and drowned out all else. Perhaps it was the wind, she thought to herself, believing it. But it happened again, louder and distinct. A deep, sorrowful cry. Without thinking, Jenna ventured toward it. Her breaths puffed the air ahead of her, leading the way even as the howl beckoned her closer. Then she saw it. A massive black form being buried in bloody white. A wolf, she breathed. The air burned her face. Her hands shook. Her teeth chattered, but just like everything else, she stood frozen. The wolf stared at her, yellow eyes gleaming gold within the midnight black of its face. Gold eyes just like the wolves in her books. Her stomach flipped and twisted, a combination of nerves and something primal warning against approaching the beast. But it was hurt. It would die. She couldn't leave it there, in the cold, all alone to freeze and disappear. With tentative steps, she closed the gap and ignored the low growl she received in Redom. Her fingers trailed the coarse hair, enjoying the way it thickened around its neck before she caressed softly down to where the blood pooled into the snow. A gunshot. But who? Who would be hunting when a blizzard was just rolling in? The next property wasn't for 5 miles. Could it have ventured all that way? It wouldn't surprise her if Mr. Johnson had shot the creature. He wasn't a fan of anything that might pose a threat to his chickens. "It's okay," she said. "You're going to be okay." It was far too big for her to carry, and the thought of dragging it felt not only dangerous but cruel given the injuries. "Wait right here." In a rush, she retraced her steps and sprinted toward her father's shed. Inside, she pulled the old sled she'd used as a child off its hook and labored it out into the snow. The beast would hang off for sure, but it was all she could think of to get it back with her and inside the house. When she finally made it back, the wolf was limp, eyes closed and tongue hanging. It looked like a corpse, and Jenna quickly fell to her knees and checked for a heartbeat. The onyx fur felt warm against her ear, and the faint thud was weak but still there. "Hang on, beastie. I'm gonna get you warm. Just hang on." She heaved it onto the sled, as careful as she could given its massive size. Its head lolled off the floor, a mere inch from the ground, as its legs dangled off the back and dug a trench in the snow. She pulled with all her strength, both hands clenching the rope even as it cut into her fingers and burned her flesh. "I'm going to save you. I swear it." Her boots sunk deep into the snow with each step, but she continued on with a passion she'd yet to have for anything other than her books. It took her 3 tries to make it up the steps to the back door, but she finally managed, scraping the wood floor in her kitchen as she continued toward the fire. Snow melted into the carpet as she fumbled into action, grabbing the first aid, hot water, blankets. Scenes from novels she'd read in the past clashed with her reality, and before she knew it, she was another person, a new woman, a character from one of the many stories she'd visited in her hours upon hours of fantasy. She tweezed out the bullet and deep, red blood poured from the wound. The poker for the fire was already red hot, and with a flinch of pity, she pressed it into the wound. The wolf jumped and emitted a low whine, but though its eyelids fluttered manically, they never opened. She grabbed the first aid kit and pulled a needle and thread from within. "Hold on." She glanced down, checking. "Boy, I've got you." She worked with precision, amazed with herself. She couldn't fix a shutter, but she'd somehow figured out how to be a doctor or a veterinarian, at least. She'd read it enough times. One of the main characters always got shot in her books, and the other would heal them. It would the them together, solidifying their bond. She looked down at the deathly still face, imagining he would awake and transform, grateful and indebted and enamored by her courage. She shook her head and finished her stitching, but the thought remained, the book on the table still fresh in her mind. Jenna sat comfortably, legs pulled up into her father's oversized recliner, a worn blanket draped over her bottom half, and a cup of steaming coffee warming her hands. The mess was gone. The wolf lay atop a mass of better blankets right beside her fire. His chest rose and fell steadier, and the white bandage circling his middle was clean. She took a sip and lowered the mug back down, staring at him. Felt good having someone other than herself inside the house. She'd been solitary for so long. It was comforting. Her father had been gone for years, and Jenna hadn't realized how alone she'd been. As long as she had her books, it never felt unbearable. She had Caspian and Heather. She had Bruce and Miss Hara, Clay and Fern. She had a million lives and loves to experience, but now that she had a companion, she realized they'd never been her own. The wolf shifted in his sleep, and his paws began to kick as if he were chasing prey within his dreams, or perhaps running away from a gun-wielding farmer. She swapped the coffee for the book she'd been reading, skimming back to the beginning of her favorite scene. The steady rhythm of her pulse was too much for him to resist. She was his, and he needed to mark her as so. Her gaze shifted up to the sleeping wolf, then back to the page. Her heart beat wilder. Her stomach flipped harder because now the fantasy was closer. It was possible. Could it happen? She fit the role. She'd been desperately alone for years. She was a spinster, the crazy woman who'd chosen to live her life with books. The only time she saw anyone at all was when she had to go into town, which wasn't very often given the ability to have food and supplies delivered. There was no need to work. Her father had left her the house, the land, and an insurance policy large enough to sustain her until death. She was the perfect heroine. Her eyes ran over the massive wolf. Had she ever seen one that size? Never. Weren't they supposed to be just like large dogs? This one seemed too big, man-sized big. Jenna pondered the notion for hours, question after question, searching through each similarity to a story she'd read in the past. Before she knew it, the sun had rose and the light between the shutters shone a pale wintry gray. The wolf stirred, and a low whine rippled from its chest. Her heart lurched, pulse accelerated. She dropped the book down onto the table and abandoned her empty mug. "It's okay," she crooned, though her voice shook in a way that made her sound anything but calm. She stood frozen for a beat, attention darting between the wolf and everywhere else as she fought to find the answer to what she should do. Food. Water. If her wolf was going to heal, he'd need to regain his strength. She rushed to the kitchen and tore through her cabinets for a bowl. Then the fridge. Jenna grabbed the pound of hamburger she'd left to thaw, then thought better of it. If he was a man, she paused, for a split moment acknowledging that her thoughts were insane. Regardless, she put the raw meat back and grabbed the leftovers of a roast instead. It was one day past its shelf life, but she didn't think the wolf would mind. It was the best she could do at the moment. Later, she'd cook for him. Warmth filled her chest, and a wide smile curved across her face. She hurried back to the room, holding a bowl of roast in one hand and a bowl of water in the other. His eyes were wide open, just as shimmering gold as they'd been the everything before. He stared at her as she approached, attention locked on her face. He didn't even acknowledge what she held in her hands, and Jenna's cheeks grew hot. I brought you some food," she said, easing closer and carefully placing the bowls beside his head. The wolf remained perfectly still, watching her even as she moved away and gingerly crawled back into the recliner. Then, he tilted his head up, sniffing at the offering she'd given him before grabbing the roast with the side of his mouth and dragging it to the blanket. Razor-sharp canines ripped away at the meat, ravaging the meager amount in no more than a couple of swallows. He tilted back and sniffed at the bowl, lapping his tongue up in search of more before settling on the water. "I know it's not much," Jenna said, running her hands over her legs. "I can make something else for us in just a little bit." The wolf turned back toward her as she spoke. She wondered what he'd say if he could answer, and imagined he'd tell her not to worry, that it was fine. He'd probably thank her for saving him and ask her for her name. Perhaps he'd tell her his. She wished she could know his. "I'm Jenna," she continued, as if he really had asked her. "I found you in the woods. Someone shot you. I removed the bullet and patched up the wound. The bleeding hasn't shown through your bandage, so I think it must have stopped. I think that's a good sign." Again he stared. Golden eyes. Intense eyes. She swallowed hard. "This is my cabin. Well, it was my father's. He passed away 3 years ago, so it's just been me here. I'll be honest, it's nice to have a man around the house." The wolf blew out a breath and dropped its head back to the blanket, turning its attention away from her and onto whatever void people found when they sought out their own thoughts. She cleared her throat. "Sorry. It's been a while since I had someone to talk to." Heavy silence followed her apology. She'd annoyed him. Her face grew hot again. She was messing it all up. Well, he was obviously still hungry. What reason did she have to wait to cook him something else? The poor man was starving. He was injured. No wonder he was annoyed. It wasn't like he could ask her for food in his current state. "Well, then, I suppose we can have some breakfast. Do you like eggs? Sausage? I think I've got some bacon left." Even as she asked the questions, she moved to complete the task. In a hurry to regain his attention and prove herself to be a good hostess, she began cooking like she hadn't done since her father was alive. She cracked 4 eggs, then as an afterthought added another 2. The men in her books always had huge appetites, and she wanted to make sure he was full. Within the span of 10 minutes, 8 sausage links and a half-pound of bacon sizzled loudly in the electric skillet, and she was just pouring the beaten eggs into pan on the stove. "I used to cook for my father all the time," she called into the living room as she scraped the mixture with her spatula. He worked long hours, so it was even earlier in the morning. He never ate quite this much, but he wasn't a big man. She finished and scraped them into a big bowl, then began forking the bacon and sausage onto a platter. Jenna took her time preparing their portions. She used the good china, arranging it how she imagined they would on the cooking shows she sometimes watched. When it was all done, she added a garnish of leafy green from the celery stalks in the crisper. She returned then, less cautious than she had the last time, and sat the plate on the floor by the wolf's head. It looked up at her, then immediately tore into the food, demolishing the hard work Jenna had done with a speed that left her dizzy. Her face fell. He hadn't even admired it, but at least he seemed to enjoy it. He hadn't complained. If anything, she'd never seen a man appreciate a woman's cooking more. With those thoughts, she smiled softly and retrieved the small portion she'd made for herself. There was still time. There'd be plenty of time to get to know each other. Once he'd regained his strength, and his appetite was satiated, they could have a more comfortable meal together. Jenna took a small bite of her eggs. "I'm glad you like it." His arms circled her waist, pulling her back into his chest. "You torture me," he whispered against her ear. "As a man, I want to be gentle, cherish you, be patient, but the beast inside me is clawing to take control." He spun her around and tilted her head up, his lips a mere inch away, parted around shallow, shaking breaths. "He wants to devour you." Jenna chewed her lip as heat pooled into her stomach. She'd give anything to have that. She'd give anything to have a man want her in that way. The few boys she dated in school had been flighty at best, cold at worst. They'd never understood her need for romance. The more she tried to love them, the more they turned away. They called her a stalker, clingy, crazy, and when she hadn't been up for losing her virginity in the most dispassionate way possible, they'd all turned toward more practical girls with lower expectations. Jenna closed the book and looked over at her wolf. He was sleeping, had been since breakfast. The light through the shutters had already dimmed, and she knew she'd need to feed them both soon if she ever wanted him to regain his strength and curb his appetite back to normal. She stood quietly, not wanting to wake him, and moved toward the kitchen to start an early dinner. Her intention for the ground beef had been to make burgers to last for 3 days. Now, she supposed it would be better suited for a meal. Tomato paste, seasonings, and breadcrumbs all lined the bottom shelf of her pantry, and she gathered them up with both hands and placed them on the counter. A meatloaf. It was the perfect first dinner. The men in her books were always like that. Meat and potato men. It took over an hour to prepare the meal. She spared no expense, took no shortcuts. Hand-mashed potatoes, creamed corn, homemade biscuits, and even a vanilla icebox cake for dessert. The wolf was awake by the time she'd finished, and this time, when she set the plate down in front of him, he didn't move as fast. Jenna pulled a chair from the kitchen table and positioned it close to him, then sat her plate in her lap and watched as he slowly admired the smell of each item. "You slept so peacefully," she said, taking a small bite. "I would have made us lunch, but I couldn't find it in my heart to wake you." He was so attentive, waiting until she'd stopped speaking before turning back to his plate. He took small, testing bites with the side of his mouth, focusing on the meatloaf. Jenna smiled. "Once we're finished, I need to change that bandage and have a look at how it's all healing." He didn't acknowledge her, just sniffed at the remaining food, licked at the potatoes a bit, then laid back down with a huff. Her smile fell. He didn't like it. She'd messed up again. Things were so much easier for the women in her books. In her stories, the main love interest had an instant connection. The moment he saw her, he fell head over heels. She shook her head. She couldn't be like that. He was injured. He was probably in pain. Horror struck her as she realized she hadn't given him anything for the pain. Quickly, she jumped up, startling the wolf in her hurry. She grabbed a handful of painkillers from the cabinet, pushed them inside another huge slice of the meatloaf, and replaced the unfinished plate he had with the new one. He devoured the new portion, seeming grateful for her thoughtfulness. When he finished and looked up at her, she gasped. His eyes were brighter, more focused, and he was smiling. He smiled at her. Jenna smiled back, so hard her cheeks hurt. "You're very welcome." She almost laughed, she was so excited. Forgetting her own food, she picked up his plate and took both of them to the sink. Her heart soared. She was right. She knew it. The minute she saw him in the snow, she'd known there was something special there. This wasn't a normal wolf. All her dreams were coming true. This was fate. All the years she'd dreamed of fantasy had been because she was destined to have one. The other boys hadn't been right because they were never meant to be. The wolf was sleeping when she returned, and she was careful not to wake him as she removed his bandage and checked the wound beneath. It wasn't bleeding. It didn't look infected. She replaced the old bandage with a new one, cleaned up her mess, then returned. His fur was beautiful, unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was soft beneath her hand. She scooted closer and stretched her body out beside his, then ran her hand through the mass, behind his ear, over his neck, avoiding the bandages. "My wolf," she whispered. "My very own." Jenna fell asleep in that spot, her arms circling him, and she slept more peacefully than she ever had before. Jenna's world spun faster. Her sun shone brighter. Her books sat unread. Her story progressed. The supplies went much faster than she'd planned, but she didn't mind. She'd have given them all for the chance she was receiving. Things had gotten serious. Each day was a dream. She took care of him. She knew his favorite foods, even what he liked to talk about, and it was almost as if she could understand him. All day long, Jenna spoke with him. Childhood stories, old jokes. She played him all her favorite songs and danced along, circling him and sashaying across the living room. He followed her every move, fascinated, fixated, urging her on. She'd never felt more desired. It was just like Clay and Fern. He'd been injured, and she'd taken him home with her. Granted, Clay had changed back into a man before she could even patch him, but that was fiction. Jenna was sure in real life it would be too difficult to change with a gunshot wound. No, he'd need time to heal, so that was what she did. She healed him. It was her only focus, her only goal. Day after day, she cleaned the wound, checked the stitches and redressed the bandage, and night after night, she laid beside him, dreaming of the day he would be able to hold her. As the time passed, her dream was slowly realized. First, he was able to lift his head all the way and shift onto his stomach. Lately, he'd even began to walk a bit, if only a few stumbling steps before he'd give up and lay back down. Each time he winced, Jenna felt the pain echo through herself. She hated his suffering. If she could take the wound away from him, absorb it into herself, she would. When the wound was healed enough to remove the stitches, Jenna realized what a big baby her wolf was. So bad, in fact, she had to tie a sheet around his arms and legs to ensure he couldn't move away from her. The wolf hadn't liked that any better than he did her administrations. He whined and growled, voicing his complaints as she gently removed each thread. She laughed. "The worst is over now, but I'm happy to see you aren't afraid to cry over your boo-boo." He snapped at her over that comment, which made her laugh harder. When it was all done and over, she gave him time to calm, removed the restraints, then sat cross-legged beside him on the floor. "It's all over now," she reassured. They returned to their new normal, eating, talking, and learning each other. The blizzard had long gone, but the snow up on the mountains was still too deep for a delivery. "I'm all out of meat," she admitted sadly as she offered him the last bit on a plate. "Thankfully, you should be well enough to be back on your feet soon. We'll just have to make do for a little while." He hadn't complained, to which she was grateful. Jenna wasn't a hunter, and even if she was, she doubted she'd find anything in the deep snow outside. "If worse comes to worse, I should be able to get a delivery out in another week or so." On the 3-week anniversary of their meeting, Jenna shyly took her spot beside him and held up her favorite book. "This one is my favorite," she admitted, cheeks burning. "Now more than ever. This is the one I was reading just before I found you." Her stomach churned as if a dozen fish were fighting to swim up into her chest and escape. "I can read you some if you'd like." She waited, holding his gaze, wishing he could speak. After a long silence, Jenna cleared her throat, opened the book to the first page, and reread the pages she'd enjoyed so many times before. It felt different this time, more personal. Her skin grew hotter. Her heart raced faster. All the scenes she'd enjoyed in private left her feeling raw and exposed as she shared them with him. Her wolf's attention never wavered. He stared at her with intense eyes and occasionally licked his jaw. Then it came, her favorite scene. The scene she'd been reading just before she went off to find him. The scene fate had placed before her. Her breaths grew ragged and sharp. Her fingers trembled on the page. The steady rhythm of her pulse was too much for him to resist. She was his, and he needed to mark her as so. The wolf shifted, startling her overly aware attention. With much effort, he pushed himself up onto unsteady legs, then tortuously slow moved closer to her. Jenna couldn't move. She couldn't seem to catch her breath. She remained locked into those golden eyes, entranced, scorched. He melted her from the core outwards, and she could do nothing but burn. It was her dream, her fantasy, finally coming to life. Her forever after was real. He was her forever. She could feel it vibrating through every memory, cell, fiber, and atom that made up her being. His gaze shifted to her neck, and he licked his lips again. The steady rhythm of her pulse was too much for him to resist. She was his, and he needed to mark her as so. Jenna leaned back as his paw reached the spot just beside her knee. "I." She started to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His lips pulled back, exposing powerful rows of teeth. He would mark her as his. He needed to mark her as his. She'd belong to him forever. He'd be hers for all eternity. Then, with a snarl, the wolf lunged forward, latching onto the place where Jenria's pulse beat so frantically. She was his, forever.